Twice in my life, I've used a Ouija board. The first time I used one, it didn't seem to work. The board was a bit dodgy, and there was one person in the group who I was certain was moving the glass, simply for theatrics. I couldn't prove it, of course, but I did have my doubts. The so-called answers to the questions were sketchy at best, and a few of them made no sense at all. The one odd thing that began happening after that night was that our cat would sit outside the doorway and stare into the direction of where we had set up the board. We all noted the strangeness of it, since the cat had never done that in the past. Eventually he stopped though, and we forgot about it and moved on. Perhaps we did make a connection that night. Maybe our setup was wrong, or our etiquette was off. I remain largely unconvinced that we had contacted actual spirits. But the second time I used one, that was a different experience entirely. A few years later, I had moved across the country to attend a university. One day, some friends and I got on the topic of Ouija and decided we'd give it a try one night. This time, however, I'd make sure we did it properly. One of my friends was quite an esoteric guy, and he did some research on how to do it right. No one else in our group had tried Ouija before, so we were mostly going in blind. But my friend made us a proper board setup and even used a sage smudging stick to, as he put it, cleanse the room of bad energies. Once that was done, the four of us sat down around the table and started. My friend mentioned that courtesy was a paramount factor for the experience, so we started off asking if there were any spirits available that could speak to us. And when we got a yes, we introduced ourselves and asked if it wouldn't mind speaking to us for a bit. We got another yes. We apologized for intruding and made it clear that the spirit did not have to answer any questions it didn't want to, and then we began our questioning in earnest. The spirit we were speaking to was a soldier killed in 1984, and he was from Yemen. He quite enjoyed the afterlife, or wherever he was at the time. He made it clear to us that death was not the end, and that there was nothing for us to fear in the afterlife. He said the concept of heaven and hell were untrue, but he did tell us that reincarnation was possible. After all this, we then decided amongst ourselves to wrap things up, having already had our minds blown away by what we had just experienced. We said thanks to the spirit and wished it all the best. We also waited for the spirit to say goodbye to us. This was an important part, according to my friend, as it would allow the spirit to return to its own realm easily. And that was it. I walked out of the room with a strange feeling of bewilderment, and yet also enormous relief. If what the spirit said was true, and I had no reason to believe it was lying to us intentionally, then death was almost something to look forward to. Up until this point, I had considered myself a pure atheist, but this one night rattled that belief so hard that I no longer considered myself as such, and will always have the memory of my Yemeni friend to prove otherwise. I do want to mention that I was very skeptical going into this experience, so I went in with the mindset of needing to carefully observe the others to see if they were messing with the glass, but throughout the entire session, the movement was so fluid and precise that all my doubts quickly evaporated, and I was genuinely astounded that there was a supernatural entity interacting with us that night. But that wasn't the only reason I started believing. The conversation we had with the spirit was so clear, and yet so bizarre, that I'll remember it forever. About 15 years ago, when I was 18, my friend Joanne and I were hanging out at her house with a few of our other school friends. I can't remember how, but we got onto the subject of seance, and towards the end of the evening, Joanne thought it would be fun to perform one as a group. Joanne and her family were from Cape Town, South Africa, which, if you don't know, is an area deeply rooted in spirituality and the supernatural. At least that's what she had told us anyway. We turned off all the lights and lit some candles. We sat at a round table, with cards fanned out around its edge. Each card had a letter of the alphabet, arranged from A to Z. Then we placed a shot glass in the middle of the cards and began the ritual. Joanne began speaking out to the spirits. I remember rolling my eyes at her in the dark, mostly because, at the time, I was an insufferable, enlightened atheist teen dork. You know the type. A cringy edgelord who thinks any form of spirituality or religion is beneath me and my superior intellect. However, what was about to happen made me question everything I believed, or didn't believe for that matter. The seance started mundane enough. A few questions were asked, and the shot glass we were resting our fingers on started to move back and forth, spelling out the answers to our simple questions. Eventually, one of my friends asked the spirit if they were associated with anyone in the room, and then the shot glass moved directly towards me. Incredulous, I asked the spirit for proof. "If you really are associated with me," I said, "then what's my mother's maiden name?" my eyes fixated on the letters that would spell out her maiden name, Jones. But the glass started spelling out something entirely different. First, the glass went to the letter T, and then to H, and then O. I knew then it was a scam of some sort. It was completely wrong. I was struck by a horrific realization. When my mother was 6 months old, her biological father died of a heart attack. A year after that, she took her stepfather's name. I completely forgot about this in the moment, as I was expecting the glass to read out the maiden name she had for the majority of her life, but it was actually spelling out her true maiden name of Thompson. It was a fact so trivial that I barely remembered it. I mean, this was something we never talked about, even within my family. It'd be hard to believe that any of my friends would know this esoteric piece of my family's history that occurred 20 years before I was even born. Nonetheless, the name was somehow being spelled out in front of my eyes. Thompson. Before I could contemplate this any longer, and before I could ask further questions to my ghostly associate, Joanne's mom came into the room and turned the lights on. With a thick South African accent, she shouted at us to stop messing around with things of this nature. This put a definitive stop to the night's proceedings. At the time, I played it off as a prank, but the more I thought about it, the more my mind wonders. Did something paranormal happen that night? It was nothing dramatic or exciting. I didn't see an apparition or a cryptid or anything like that. But I can't help but feel like this experience changed me in some way. Many years ago, I was a bored teenager alone in the house on a Saturday afternoon. I decided to make a Ouija board from, of all things, a travel Scrabble set. I laid out the tiles, grabbed a glass, and tried to make contact with whoever or whatever was out there in the great beyond. Several times I asked, "Is there anybody there?" Frankly, I wasn't expecting anything to happen, and for a few moments nothing did. But then the glass started to move under my finger. It slid towards the corner of the board to the tiles I had arranged to spell the word yes. That was enough for me. I immediately returned the glass to the kitchen and disassembled the board, understandably freaked out. But the house suddenly felt oppressive, and I felt ill at ease enough to want to get out of there as soon as possible. So I locked up and decided to get on my bike and ride to a friend's house, just for the sake of being around other people so I could relax. The trip took about 15 minutes, but the oppressive, uneasy feeling stayed with me the entire way. When I arrived at my friend's house, I knocked on the back door, but I got no response. I peered through the windows and it was obvious to me that no one was home, so I decided to try another friend's house, but again there was no one home there either. In all, I tried 6 or 7 friends, racing my bike over quite a bit of distance as I made my way from one house to the next, but no one was home. Not my friends, not their family members, no one. The strangest thing in all of this was that at each window I peered into, I could see my friend's high school photo of that year staring back at me, smiling. They wore an odd grin, almost unearthly. I felt very conscious I was being watched by something that seemed to manifest through the photos. It's hard to describe it exactly, but I felt that in each instance I was expected. Like the photos knew I was coming and knew I'd be alone without the safety of other people. The best way I can think to describe it is that it felt like I was being toyed with by something malevolent. When I reached the final house, I had traveled miles and used up most of the afternoon, so I decided I'd return home. My family was there at this point, and I gratefully noted that the house felt normal once again. But when I visited each of my friends' houses over the next week or so, I made sure to look at the photos on display. The pictures looked perfectly normal. Their smiles were that of typical teenage kids, and much less of what I'd experienced days before. At one point in my life, I didn't believe in anything paranormal or in things outside the realm of science, but all of that would change in my freshman year of college. That year, I moved into a dorm in a very old historic building at a university in Florida. I quickly made friends with Gina, the girl who lived next door to me, and with Beatrice, a girl who lived on the floor above me. On one of our first nights hanging out, we got to talking about ghosts and spiritual stuff, something we quickly bonded over since the three of us were into the occult and whatnot. After a few minutes, Beatrice suggested we make our own Ouija board and have some fun with it. I had a little experience with Ouija boards, but nothing remarkable, just oblivious schoolgirls at sleepovers who never quite got it working correctly. Beatrice's suggestion piqued my interest though. Maybe it was the ancient building and the rumors of hauntings. I'm not sure, but the three of us unanimously decided that we were in. For that first night, we crafted our Ouija board out of cardboard and some markers and sat down to begin. Shockingly, the board worked almost immediately. We were quickly introduced to an entity from the other side. It said its name was Shove, and most of the time that's how it referenced itself, though on a number of occasions it would also call itself Solo, or even just the initials SO. These sessions continued nearly every day after. It became like an obsession for us. It's all we would talk about. I'm not sure if it was because the thought of speaking to something otherworldly was exciting, or if something else was going on. We tested Shove on several occasions, once by asking it to name the stepmother of a recently befriended girl who we'd invited to our Ouija session that night. It guessed immediately, without her having her hands on the board, and we had just met her. There's no way it could have known this. Nights later, we asked Shove to give us a sign that it was really there. We heard a noise near the door to my room, which was securely closed for the sake of privacy. We looked over and saw a shadow outside of the door. We opened it, and of course no one was there. We closed it and the shadow was gone. Over the course of the semester, little things continued to happen, strange things. Objects would be moved, or sinks would randomly turn on and off all by themselves when no one was around, stuff like that. After a few weeks of this, things started getting really weird. One night, I was playing the board with Beatrice's boyfriend and Gina. Beatrice was laying with her head in her boyfriend's lap, not touching the board. Suddenly, she started panicking and hyperventilating. We thought she must be having a random panic attack or something similar, but she claimed she was unable to control where her eyes were looking. We decided to take her out of the building because she was so freaked out, but when we reached the lobby, she swore she had seen something out of the corner of her eye. But when she looked and saw no one was actually there, she bolted out the front doors, terrified. Shove seemed to have turned on Beatrice, for reasons we didn't understand. On another night, not long after that, the three of us girls were playing the board when Beatrice told us her back was hurting and the pain was getting worse. She asked us to look and see if she had sunburn on her back. I guess the pain she felt mimicked what you would feel after too much sun. But it wasn't sunburn. What we saw was a splotch of fresh scratches stretching across her lower back. She hadn't been leaning on anything and had both hands on the board the entire time. Needless to say, we were terrified. Around this time, Beatrice started acting very strange. For the first few months I'd known her, she was always calm and down to earth, but she became extremely short-tempered and possessive. I wasn't sure if this was a mental health crisis, or if it was our nightly activities causing these side effects. I don't think I'll ever know, but I remember Beatrice screaming at me and stomping up the stairs to her room one day, and being so shocked at the out-of-character outburst. Once, during a fight with her boyfriend, Beatrice ripped her hair out and slammed her head on the floor, and a week after that, she was involuntarily institutionalized after telling her therapist she was going to take her own life. This was obviously upsetting for Gina and for myself, but then Gina confided in me that she'd been having the same types of thoughts. Then one morning, I woke up and saw messages on my phone saying Gina had gone to the hospital earlier that morning because she had woken up and couldn't breathe. The doctor said it was a tonsil issue, but the timing seemed weird. Both Gina and Beatrice ended up dropping out of college. I spent the rest of the semester and the next one in that same room, but never had any serious issues. I had a roommate the second semester of that year, but she didn't have any issues either. I played the Ouija board every once in a while to show curious friends the ghost that lived in my room. Shove was always there, but he did nothing more than respond on the board. I'm still in touch with Gina and Beatrice. Bea did a full turnaround and returned to her old self after dropping out. None of us were sure if this was due to her separation from stressful college work, or if it was that she'd gotten away from our building. I still have so many questions. Had Beatrice been possessed? Who was Shove? And was it even real, or do we make him up because we desperately wanted to believe something else was out there? I'm afraid that after all this time, I'm never going to get the answers to what actually happened to us that year at college.